Okay, hello everyone. I hope that I'm officially live now. I was having some trouble connecting earlier today, so let's hope that this event is officially live and that things are making sense. Thank you all for your patience, and I'm so sorry that I'm running a little bit late and behind schedule. So I hope everything is good to go. If anything, the folks and organizers at the Amherstburg Freedom Museum will give me a sense of what's happening. I'm just asking everyone, if possible, if you could please save your questions until the end of our session today. That'll give me a chance to be able to pop back into the chat and be able to see what everyone is saying and get a sense of any questions that you might have. So I'm just going to double check and make sure that I am actually indeed on Facebook Live and that things are up and running. So let's hope that this is going well. Okay, it looks like I am. So I'm going to get started and let's go. So thank you so much to the Amherstburg Freedom Museum for organizing this Facebook Live session and for having me to talk to you all today about some of my work on the educational encounters of Black women teachers in Ontario. I'm really happy to be presenting today, largely because I actually completed my undergraduate degree at the University of Windsor. And when I was there, I learned so much from people and knowledge keepers who were from and participated in the area and were from the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. And so a lot of these local historians and knowledge keepers in the area were so helpful in getting me to get a sense of Black Canadian history and what life was like in this geographic region. So I am forever indebted to the community for expanding my knowledge and awareness of Black life in the area. And I'm very much looking forward to talking to you all today about what I think are some of the intersections with a lot of the educators who are actually from the area and what they can tell us about the experiences of Black women educators, and what this means for our understanding of education in Canada more broadly. So, in her analysis of missing Black self representations in Canadian schools, scholar Annette Henry describes the desire within Black Canadian communities for liberatory practices in teaching, where children of African descent are adequately supported in Canadian schools. In her work, Henry defined African centered education as a shift away from Western notions of knowledge to involve a reconceptualizing of educational theory and practice, one that includes the cultural and historical knowledges and values, as well as the contradictions that are present in African cultures and society. This liberatory pedagogy represents not only a counterposition to Eurocentric frameworks within the Canadian curriculum, but it also considers the potential of Black self representation. The oral histories that I feature in my session today give space for the importance of Black women's professional lives as educators, and I also argue that they became a fundamental component to challenging and restructuring white dominated schooling institutions. I argue that Black women teachers created various kinds of liberatory pedagogies to consider the place and the diverse lived experiences of persons of African descent in Canada. As a result, I emphasize the significance of self definition and naming Black women's experiences in this work as an important way for us to understand how Black women crafted inclusive learning spaces for all students, but most especially for Black children. In addition, while I'll discuss the experiences of Black Canadian populations in the broadest sense today, I am in fact talking about diverse Black experiences that included Canadian born, Caribbean born, and continental born Africans. So, my review of Black women teachers really begins at the end of the Second World War, when Canada's rising population combined with growing immigration dramatically increased the need for government involvement and state funded projects. The government provided significant amounts of money to fund new schools, universities, hospitals, and it even established vocational programs to train young children and young people in the skilled trades. But Canada's growing population continued to swell, and this caused a huge teacher shortage within the province. And as the teacher shortage began to grow, doors opened up for Black Canadian women to enter teachers, colleges, and training facilities, and it allowed them the space and the capacity to be employed in the field of teaching relatively quickly. So, teaching became important for Black women because of the notions of professionalism that it was attached to, but also because it was viewed as a way for Black women to access respectable employment. And so, it was a way also to combat discriminatory hiring practices that often segregated Black women almost exclusively to domestic work. Some of these early educators that I actually spoke to for my book were from Essex and Kent County. And so this included people from Chatham, Amherstburg, Colchester, Windsor. And these women all received their training either through emergency summer training programs, or they actually went to teacher training institutions throughout the province. And so some teacher training institutions were in Hamilton, some were in Toronto, some were also in Windsor. And these emergency training and summer courses created several opportunities for Black female educators. And such was the case of Camille, who is a woman that I spoke to for my book. She joined an increasing number of women who entered teachers' colleges as a result of the opportunities that summer courses and redefined entrance requirements provided. Camille explained that her parents could not afford to send her on to university after she had completed high school. But she received a notification from the Department of Education in the Chatham Daily News. And this advertisement encouraged teachers to take a summer training course. And this would be one of the main reasons why Camille decided to become an educator. She was also looking to find additional supports for her parents who, of course, could not fully afford to take her or to pay for her training. So before her training was complete, Camille was able to actually obtain a job at Greenville School in Chatham Township. And as a result of sometimes the lower pay and the inconsistent pupil attendance and conditions in schools, rural schools were not always attracting trained educators in significant numbers, so that by the time Camille completed her training, she and many other Black educators who were trained in the same kind of way were actually actively recruited to teach in predominantly Black schools or predominantly Black communities. And we'll get to a little bit about why that's the case. And in fact, Camille recalled that in addition to this school that she was teaching at, Black women could only teach at 2 schools in the area. This was Green Valley and Shrewsbury. Camille and other educators reflected an awareness of racial exclusion that was part of the Canadian educational and workplace experience. While it is difficult for us to know whether Black educators were able to easily move from school to school as frequently as their white counterparts, since Black populations at the time were both rural and urban based, Black educators tended to stay in these communities and teach at these institutions for extended periods of time. So I was finding that some of the educators that I spoke to were teaching at these institutions for 15, 20 years, and they really helped to mold and craft generations of young minds. And this became a really important way for how they thought about their professional careers. In other instances, Black awareness of racial discrimination was incredibly clear, so much so that educators anticipated whenever they went for job interviews with particular kinds of school boards. This was the case of Melinda, whose husband actually screened schools in Chatham in order to ensure that they would hire a Black woman. Knowing that interviewing for jobs would mean that she would have to take a leave from work, Melinda's husband called schools to make sure that they were open to hiring a Black woman. Melinda recalled, quote, "In any case, he called Lambton Kent School in Dresden, Ontario, and said, 'I have a young woman in mind who might be applying, but there's no reason for her to take the day off work if there's no chance. She does happen to be Black, of color.' The person he talked to said, 'That won't matter, have her come in.' And I came up for the interview, and I mentioned my teaching expertise was in science. I did get the job, and so I taught in Lambton, Kent for 3 years, from 1965 to 1968. So, what I think Melinda's story tells us is of the intricate ways that Black Canadians understood Canadian schooling systems and the larger social patterns that often restricted Black employment. They negotiated these parameters and ensured that they would be able to have access to work. I think Belinda's story also tells us about the significance of persons of African descent in trying to negotiate these lines and these subtle forms and practices of discrimination in their local communities. I also think it speaks to the value that Melinda's income played to her family and her community relationships, right? That the fact that her husband was so aware and so astutely concerned about her taking off work and ensuring that she was actually able to get the job, I think reflects broader conversations about Black women's economic viability and their contributions to the household income in a way that we often don't talk about in these conversations. In other instances, Black women were encouraged to enroll in Teachers College as a result of strong community and kin relationships. When Nicolette, a resident of the Windsor Essex area, was encouraged by one of her friends to enroll in Teachers College, she tapped into a career network that stemmed from her community relationships. Born in 1943, Nicolette's family moved from North Buxton to Windsor in 1948, and she grew up in a predominantly Black neighborhood. And here, Nicolette's community comprised of wartime housing developments where most men in the area worked at Chrysler, General Motors, or Ford Motor Company. And what's interesting is that Nicolette was thinking through the fact that employment, particularly the employment as several Black men in the Windsor area, actually translated to a sense of community stability and encouraged the development of support systems that would foster community cohesion and, of course, open up employment opportunities for Black women. Nicolette reported that members in her community knew each other and that the children were supervised by women in the community who were nicknamed the McDougal Street Mothers. So, Black mothers used home, church, and community spaces to model a particular kind of value system, to impart knowledge, and to shield community children from mainstream forms of discrimination. And as part of this, and as part of what Nicolette saw as a sense of community support, she had friends in the neighborhood and role models who encouraged her educational pursuits. And while she initially wanted to apply to a nursing program, Nicolette instead opted for Teachers College because of the flexible entrance requirements that was available in teaching institutions in the 1950s and 1960s. But once hired in schools, Black women found that they were often isolated and alone in their quest to create more inclusive spaces for Black children. In fact, some Black educators in my book soon found that once they began organizing and creating programs, they experienced hostility from white coworkers and administrators. And this was especially around the time when they advocated for more permanent solutions to deal with Black student engagement in schools. It seems that whenever Black educators encouraged programs that would require systemic change and a restructuring of the ways in which Ontario schools treated racialized students, administrators were often weary of making permanent changes. This was the case of Toronto educator Tamara, who recalled having a fear in Ontario schools around the province's growing Black populations in schools and the ways that this posed particular kinds of challenges for educators who sought to create more permanent and systemic changes within the Ministry of Education. Tamara recalls, quote, "Well, it's very easy to be one of a few. Nobody is afraid to discuss with you. It's when the population of Blacks grows, there are many educators, that's when people begin to say they are starting a movement. And so some people love to remain one of the few, and they keep kicking the ladder down when anybody tries to climb up, because it's very easy to be an oracle there." End quote. So alliances were often tenuous once Black educators and once our Black educators began to organize and advocate for broader systemic changes to help these students. Tamara's reference to being an oracle at her school also reflected some of these expectations in mainstream schools that often placed Black women as the sole speakers of diverse communities of people. It's also possible that within Tamara's critique of some educators who were perceived of as being oracles, that school systems often at times really weren't thinking about the hiring practices, and they often believed that Black educators would often build alliances solely on the basis of race. And what I found and continue to find really in the diverse range of educators is that Black teachers had a diverse range of ways of thinking, of ways of teaching. Some of those aspects were, of course, rooted in race, but they weren't exclusively this. And so the assumption, for example, that Black educators would only build alliances and relationships with one another on the basis of race really doesn't allow for the complexity of their experiences, and it doesn't allow for some of the nuances in how they built relationships and sometimes how they didn't, right? So I think often at times when we think through the experiences of Black educators, particularly Black female educators, are never allowed the capacity and the space to be unique, that they always have to be speaking for this broader collective. And I think that Black women often moved back and forth between these philosophies and ideas. And so I think Tamara's critique reflected the differences that existed in professional philosophies and Black women's work ethics. And so it was part of, but it wasn't exclusive to, their positionalities as racialized women in schooling institutions. Tamara's discussion also alludes to institutional forms of discrimination within Ontario's labour market that only allowed for the promotion of a few racial minorities, thereby increasing competition and what she describes as a tendency to kick the ladder down amongst minority employees. So now I wanted to shift the gears a little bit so to get a sense of course, how educators thought of and began and entered teaching, but also what they did once they were in schools and were practicing liberatory pedagogies. So I think the ways in which Black educators responded to Eurocentric school curricula spoke to the multiple and fluid identities of Black resistance in Canada. As Heidi Mirza argues, Black women not only resisted racism within educational institutions, but they redefined and recreated their own understandings of identity and Black womanhood. Black women often reinterpreted the curriculum to reflect their experiences as racial minorities and to represent Canada's diverse student populations, many of whom were Black. They also inserted Black experiences within their individual classrooms. Black women's involvement as educators can be understood then as a constant shift between institutional and community work. Conscious of their precarious positions within mainstream educational institutions, Black women strategically negotiated ideals of Black Canadian identity to serve both individual and collective needs. Such was the case of Bianca, who, after being passed over for a job promotion at her school in the 1970s, decided to take a stand for what she felt was overt forms of discrimination in her school. She explains, quote, "And I told her, this is not about me. This is about the bigger picture. In other words, this isn't about me as one person. This is about Black people. That's the message I left with her. Was I upset about leaving? Yes, I was. But it was about the bigger picture. You can't do me that. Because for me not to make a move, it makes you feel like you are right to do that, and I just left her." End quote. And so Bianca's struggle for inclusion within the education system became part of a larger movement for Black collective action at her school. Bianca's recognition of racial prejudice and discrimination made her constantly aware of the histories and the presence of persons of African descent. But she also was thinking through her position in the professional working sphere and how that was connected to the progress and success of Black Canadians as a whole. So this pedagogy was often sensitive to the presence, the history, and the needs of Black Canadians, but it also circumvented mainstream notions that often silenced African descended peoples and limited their opportunities within academic institutions. While it is often difficult to chart whether this was a common practice held by all Black women teachers, the ability of some educators to augment the curriculum within their individual classrooms recognizes the processes that they used to insert diverse historical experiences in Ontario's schools. And although limited by systemic discrimination, some Black educators situated community experiences to connect with diverse groups of students in Canadian schools, and they often had to do this within institutional confines. So, this worked not only to give Black women access to some power, but it also gave them authority within their classrooms on their own terms. It is within this context that Black women's liberatory pedagogies worked to transform student opportunities, it worked to circumvent racist expectations, and it challenged racist beliefs about racialized students. In other instances, Black women demonstrated subtle practices of resistance that complicated Black experiences in relationship to the nation. For example, when Canadian-born educator Clara became involved in Black student activism in the 1960s, she was influenced by diverse transnational experiences that expanded her understandings of Black history. At her school, she began advocating for more materials that represented accurate Black history, and she also began reconceptualizing how history of Black Canadians was categorized at the library in her school. As a teacher and librarian at a local school in Windsor, Ontario, Clara discussed how she would strategically move Black books out of the Black history section and place them in the war and Canadian history sections of her school library. So, for example, Clara categorized John Brown's raid of Harper's Ferry under military history in her school library. And she explains, quote, John Brown came to Ingersoll, which is just outside of London, to try and recruit Black men to fight against slavery and the Harper's Ferry raid. Well, that's military. So I said I would let's categorize this kind of history differently in a way that really brings out the significance of the stuff. And I believe that this was part of Clara's liberatory pedagogy because it directly challenged the ways that the nation was constructed in school settings and inserted Blackness into Canadian national narratives that sought to erase the Black experience. So I think Clara's move here was really thinking through Blackness and Blackness as belonging to and being part of Canada. And I think sometimes, particularly whenever we construct how best to talk about Black history and to talk about Black Canadian life, it is often occupying this kind of siloed and usually segregated experience, something that is separate from Canadian national histories, something that stands separate from the rest of Canada. And so it's very clear that Clara understood, right, the significance of Black Canadian contributions to the rest of Canada, but also that it indeed was part of Canada's national history, something that doesn't always have to be separate from the important stories of the Black Canadian experience. And other women took more direct action and obtained additional qualifications, and they joined curriculum writing groups to ensure that Black Canadian history was part of the school environment. This was also the case of Candace, who created a Black unit, a Black history unit at her school, and submitted the draft proposal to her school board for implementation into the 1980s. And despite having her proposal rejected, Candace continued to use and teach her Black history unit in many of her classrooms. Candace's continuation of teaching this unit can be interpreted as a direct resistance to school requirements that required her to teach a prescribed provincial curriculum. And we can talk a little bit about what that might mean, because often at times the challenge has been for educators, you have this curriculum expectation. When and how do you insert Black Canadian history into that conversation? But instead, Candace used the limited spaces that she had of classroom autonomy to conduct her own research that would deliberately highlight the importance of Black history in Canada. Another educator that I spoke to, Lisa, took on a similar approach when she helped to write one of the first Black studies programs in her school district. She joined a committee of 5 other Black educators, and the program later received approval from the ministry for implementation across school districts in Canada. In addition to this program, Lisa encouraged students to learn about the Black Canadian experience, but she also included diasporic histories that was often missing from the provincial curriculum. Lisa says, quote, I had the students in the class every day. One of them would go down and read something significant or important, something about African Canadian or even African Americans who had come and live in Canada. So this would send little outbursts across the school. Lisa's deliberate insertion of Black outbursts throughout the school served as a reminder of the historical presence of Blacks within Canada, and it supplemented the historical erasure of persons of African descent in the curriculum. Furthermore, Lisa connected diasporic identities across geographic and national boundaries to join the Black experience. So another important distinction that Black women's liberatory pedagogies often considered was the experiences of persons of African descent across geographic regions, right? So it was considering the experiences in the Caribbean. It was considering the experiences in the United States. It was contextualizing the experiences in Canada. It was even including conversations about what was happening in the UK and in the continent of Africa itself. So it had a more expansive understanding of what it meant to be a person of African descent, of what Blackness looked like in different local regions, in broader transnational conversations that became really important to their liberatory approach. And so I think it is here that we see Black women's liberatory strategies as deliberate yet smaller acts of subversion within schools. So Black women's experiences within broader forms of discrimination gave them personal and intimate understandings of power and resistance. Negotiating classroom autonomy to shift the curriculum and position Blacks as being present and active within the historical and contemporary experiences of Black Canadian history became an important part of their professional lives. Speaking to what scholar George Yancey describes as micro acts of resistance, Black women teachers not only disrupted Eurocentric curriculum models, but they also reaffirmed the Black presence as part of this curriculum. In his analysis of Black resistance in North America, George Yancey contends that because Black bodies are constantly under discursive and physical erasure, the ability of Blacks to resist and affirm the Black experience is fundamentally important. And so Yancey argues that these micro acts of resistance periodically shifted the tables of power and created spaces of Black value within systems of institutional dominance. Therefore, while organized resistance was one of the many ways that women worked to assert their own power over their lives, the incorporation of smaller acts of resistance, usually through their liberatory pedagogies, demonstrated individual agency, and it also reconceptualized what was possible for professional working women. And I think this is so interesting because in the women that I spoke to, they often never conceived of and thought about the work that they were doing as necessarily liberatory or even a grand act of resistance. You know, many of them were thinking through these everyday practices as trying to shift the experiences, as trying to create more inclusive spaces for diverse populations of people. And so even though Black women often at times don't talk about their experiences as incredibly liberatory, what the impact of that actually was that it created inclusive spaces and it expanded the knowledge of Black Canadian life in a school system that usually never talked about Black Canadian experiences or talked about Black Canadian experiences in very limited ways. So while Black women's teaching approaches seems to have a limited impact on the broader curriculum changes, the connections to Black communities distinctly characterize Black women's liberatory pedagogies and their politics. In the work and particularly in some of the research on Black feminism, sociologist Heidi Mirza argues that on the surface, Black women's pedagogies can appear to be conservative because of its connections to mainstream ideas and its focus on inclusion. But they are actually radically subversive for the work on social transformation. Charting Black women's educational experiences as out of place, disrupting, and untidy, Mercer challenges us to look beyond these essentialist notions of Black women's responses and to consider inequality as a way to think through resistance, right? That in fact, Black women's experiences were really thinking through the transformative ways to create inclusion for diverse groups of students. So, Black women's activities often supports this argument that they used their authority and position within schools to better prepare Black students for the social and systemic forms of oppression that they would face, while also reaffirming and reinforcing the existence of the importance of Black people as part of Canada's national identity. So Black women's involvement as educators can be understood as this constant shift back and forth between institution and community work. Conscious of their precarious positions within mainstream educational institutions, Black women strategically negotiated ideas of Black Canadian identity to serve individual and collective needs. They used limited opportunities available to them. They renegotiated and reinterpreted mainstream curriculum mandates to plant themselves as permanent fixtures within the Canadian landscape. Their strategies were marked by individual classroom practices that often infused lessons about African descended peoples and also prepared racialized students for the things that they would face, the kinds of challenges that they would face. And often at times, I spoke to educators who particularly described this investment that they had to the success of young Black students and the ways that they wanted to affirm them. And in some instances, students thought that this was incredibly harsh, or they thought that this was, that sometimes these educators had high expectations. But Black women teachers often referenced the necessity and significance of having these kinds of expectations for students and how that would help them prepare them for life outside of schooling institutions, right? So Black women were so astutely aware of these experiences both inside of school and outside of school, and they used that to craft their understanding of teaching and teaching practice. So Black women's presence and role then within Canadian institutions directly challenged conceptions of Blackness in Canada, right? It directly thought through and created more nuanced conversations of Black identity in Canada. And through this, Black female educators remained connected to their ideas of community work and racial uplift, but they also developed particular kinds of pedagogies that worked to circumvent mainstream institutional mandates that often denied and rejected Black participation in the Canadian educational process. Instead, Black women's presence and reaction to various forms of oppression used education as a tool for transformation and community and racial survival. So, just to conclude, the challenges for combating and creating systemic change for Black students in Canada remains an ongoing process. Considering that much of our education system has not shifted or adequately restructured its frameworks to create more inclusion for racial minority students, there are often limited to no lesson plans discussing the ways that educators can shift their focus on the Eurocentric curriculum to consider more Afrocentric learning pedagogies. It means then that educators must do more work to dismantle implicit stereotypes and assumptions within schools. It must also mean that this work cannot exclusively rest on the shoulders of the few racialized educators within schooling systems. And I recognize that while I'm talking about Black women today and their particular use of pedagogies, what I'm actually trying to say is that there's much that can be learned from Black women's liberatory pedagogies, but it is not solely their responsibility to do all of this labor. And we can talk a little bit about what that means. But Collaboration for creating learning tools must consider the ways that we implicitly bring biases into our own school environments and, of course, our pedagogical approaches. That a move away from Eurocentric curriculum must be one that considers Indigenous, Black, Asian, South Asian, and other ethnic and racial minorities as knowledge producers and holds their pedagogical approaches as important sites of learning. Black women educators experienced varying forms of discrimination that was both subtle and overt in nature. Even as mainstream institutions sought out Black women educators for their changing student populations, these schools continued to encourage limited forms of inclusion that we still have till today. Black women teachers remained connected to ideas of community work and racial uplift, but they also adapted to the presence of racial and gendered oppression in varying ways. So I believe that we can begin to think about our pedagogical approaches in the same ways, that we need to consider the conditions, the environments, and the assumptions that we create both inside and outside of school settings as essential to the survival of not only our students, but our communities as a whole. So I think Black women's liberatory pedagogies has long been thinking through these complex and complicated experiences, that they often don't think about the Black presence in Canada as monolithical. It thinks about it as heterogeneous. It thinks about it as constantly shifting and evolving and moving. But it also thinks about it in response to these broader systems of gender discrimination, these broader conversations of racial discrimination in school settings to really create inclusive places. And so I leave this work to think through the Black women who have been the architects of anti-racist education, who have been thinking through inclusive educational practices, and hope that more weight and space is given to Black educators who have been so fundamental to ensuring the success of not only Black students and their educational experiences, but across disciplines and across schooling institutions. Black women have also thought through the care and support and educational kind of knowledge of all students. So thank you so much. I'm going to leave my conversation there and hopefully welcome some questions. I'm going to look through and see if anything's coming through the chat. But if anyone has any questions, concerns, or issues, please feel free to drop some of those questions now. I hope that I can see them. Okay, so I think I have a question. Did you find it was difficult for the women you interviewed to open up about the negative or positive experiences they had? Did you find that you had to build relationships of trust before they opened up, or were they quick to share this information? Great question. So I have a really complicated relationship because I found that I'm of course also a trained educator, and so there were moments when, by virtue of my training, by virtue of my race and my gender, I was able to connect with Black women educators who understood their experiences and who often discussed their experiences in really candid ways. But many people I had to form really authentic relationships with, particularly with Canadian born educators in areas like Chatham, like Buxton, Windsor, and these areas, right? That the women that I was speaking to really wanted to know why I wanted to talk to them about their experiences as educators. They wanted to know what was the purpose of this research. And so a lot of these women really held me accountable and ensured that I wasn't just coming into community to extract knowledge and information, but rather that it was a collaborative process in a way that truly honored their experiences and honored the kinds of stories that they told. So I found that it took some time to build those relationships, but once I did, women were incredibly honest and open about their experiences. There were moments when some women recalled predominantly positive experiences, and there were moments when women spoke about, deeply, deeply painful processes and practices of violence, of isolation, as being part of their work experience. And so I feel really grateful that they shared some of these intimate conversations with me and talked about how difficult the teaching experience was. And I think sometimes we never get to the really difficult challenges in the stories. We often think about teaching as being this fun and rewarding experience all the time, but for Black women, they really engaged in incredibly difficult experiences that were both positive but also quite negative. And so there were some of these challenges that I think were part of the experience. So yeah, I think it was an incredibly informative experience, positive experience, but also it came with its challenges. So I see there's a follow-up question. What was the research process like in terms of interviews, and how did I find women? And did I have a standard set of questions that I asked every time? Really good question. So some of the things that I did was I actually sent a call for participants in retired teaching and professional journals. So if there's, a retired teachers Facebook group, or if there was any organization, I would send a call for participants that way. I also sent a call for participants in, the newsletters that Amherstburg Freedom Museum was holding up. The Buxton National Historical Site was incredibly helpful for getting me connected with some educators and speaking to them. And so once I built relationships of trust with some of the women, they would refer me to someone else, or contact someone else that was also an educator or who they met at teachers college, and that continued to build those relationships. And usually the interviews were often semi-structured, so everyone was always different. I had a set of research questions, of course, that I wanted to ask women because I thought it was important to getting a sense of the diversity and the complexity of their experiences. But some women wouldn't want to talk about those things. Some women wanted to talk about something completely different. And so it was really wonderful to have this relationship where we had really shared authority in the process. Sometimes I would take a back seat and let women's stories dictate where we would go in the interview process. And then some women needed a little bit more guidance or wanted me to ask my questions before we had a more relaxed conversation. And so it really depended on who I was speaking to at the time, but almost all of the women did a little bit of both, where I would have some questions that I would ask, and then in some instances they would talk to me about really important things that they wanted to remember. And so you'll notice that at the beginning of this talk I spoke about the significance and importance of Black women's self-representation, and it becomes such an important part of my book and the work is to think through Black women's stories and the things that they chose to tell me and the significance of those things, right? That was important, that it's important that a woman remembers an experience that happened 20 years ago because it marked her professional work life in very particular ways. So that's where kind of these interview processes happened. Thank you so much, Miriam. So what are my thoughts on the isolation that Black teachers still experience today and the lack of support that they receive? Really good question. I think often at times Black women's experiences in schools is particularly marked by isolation and a lack of support, that often at times Black women have had to make these broader institutional changes with very little support and with very little understanding from other colleagues, from the institution themselves. And so my thought is that I am still concerned and disturbed by the fact that Black women's experiences that was happening in the 1940s and 1950s still continues to mark Black women's experiences into contemporary moments and in present day. So I think Black women have been incredibly powerful in trying to create spaces of safety for themselves and in trying to create mechanisms by which they can support other people. But I think so much work needs to be done to think through how to create more inclusive professional spaces for women. And I don't think that we've done this well. And I don't think we've been thinking through how women experience isolation. So, in some of the women that I talk to, they experience so much isolation in school staff rooms, right? And school staff rooms are supposed to be places of access, they're supposed to be places of inclusion for educators. And in fact, women were experiencing the most overt forms of discrimination in these places. So it's an acknowledgement and a desire for our institutions to recognize the varying ways that Black teachers experience isolation, and that we need to have more mechanisms in place that not only consider the significance of Black students, but also considers the significance of professional work environments that are more inclusive, right? So I think there needs to be more work to be done to consider these multiple levels of anti-Blackness that sometimes continues into our school systems. So another question is the relationship with educators mostly post-secondary, grade school, or both? So most of this one was actually, I almost exclusively talked to educators who were teaching in grade school. Very rarely was I talking to educators who were teaching in post-secondary institutions, although some went on to continue post-secondary training and their qualifications. But this work focuses specifically on grade school educators, which the overwhelming number of Black women educators still teach in this kind of sector, not exclusively, but definitely in this sector. So I was speaking mainly to grade school, elementary school, and high school student teachers. Thank you so much, Shannon. Good to see you as well. Uh, yes, lots of love to the Buxton fam. I miss you all, and I hope we get to see each other soon. All right, did I get a chance to interview immigrant Black female educators, and what was their experiences? And what were the ways that their own experiences were different from Canadian-born educators? Really good question, Ada. I think yes, to answer your question, yes, I did. I spoke to predominantly Canadian-born educators and Caribbean-born educators. So today's talk featured predominantly Canadian-born educators, but many of the Caribbean-born educators that I spoke to reflected many similar conversations around isolation, around a disconnect, around feeling like they had to supplement this predominantly Eurocentric curriculum to talk about the Black experience. Canadian-born Black educators often had a longer and more intimate connection to schooling systems. They had lots of experience being students in Ontario school systems, and so they really were talking about the disconnect that happened and where the interventions were. Caribbean-born educators often came with extensive training from their birth homes, and usually, once they came into Canada, were really trying to advocate for more inclusive practices. And so their philosophies were different. Sometimes those philosophies connected, particularly around community programming, particularly around after-school programming for young people, for young Black students. But Caribbean educators often reflected and talked about this notion of understanding their diasporic identities, of understanding also class differences, right? We're talking about Caribbean educators who came from home countries where they had extensive training and an understanding of what it meant to exist in these intersectional spaces. So these things were very much different from, I think, some of their Canadian-born counterparts. And because my work ends towards the 1980s, I actually don't get into conversations around African-born educators until very late, right? These African-born educators were entering the teaching kind of field slightly later than Caribbean and Canadian-born educators were. So it ends at that area. So very different in their experiences and relationships to the Canadian education system, but they met in moments when they were trying to create programming and more inclusive practices for students. So they didn't always connect with how best to do that, but they definitely connected with this broader vision of needing and the desire to include Black experiences into the curriculum. So, Brenda, you're saying that when you found that when you moved into this community many years ago, it was so diverse, but working as a teacher in the public board, you're finding that students are underrepresented. And in your opinion, how do you attract more BIPOC folks to the profession and the region and to teachers' colleges? It seems that we've kind of gone backwards in the chain. That's a really good question. And I'm not necessarily sure. So if you think through if the historical context of why, for example, Black women educators entered teacher training programs in the 1950s and 1960s, it was because Canada's teacher shortage allowed for flexible entrance requirements. It understood that educators were going to be working full time and going to training. And it also released and facilitated training incentives that were directly in Black communities. And so, if we think through some of these models, it's possible that that might be where we want to reach people again, right? One is to consider the fact that persons of African descent, and if we even go further, racialized communities have varying kinds of constraints. And so it's thinking about how we can create more flexible programs that allow for their training. And perhaps one of the most significant ones is that we really need our training institutions to recognize in a better way internationally trained educators and teachers. So we have a plethora of racialized communities in the province of Ontario and in Canada more broadly that have extensive and significant training in their birth homes, and yet that has not been accepted and translated properly into our institutions. And so as a result, we are having this disconnect where there's tons of educators, but they're not maybe necessarily going to regions that they can. And so I think there needs to be a way to incentivize these people. And of course, there needs to be a valuing of their knowledge and their skill sets in a way that our institutions have not yet spoken to. And so these are some of the things that I think we can do to attract people. But we really need a complete remodeling of our curriculum that includes diverse models of people and includes diverse representations of people. You know, when I started this research, historically people were saying that, oh, there weren't that many Black educators who were teaching in Canada, because the public face of teaching has been in the past and still continues to be predominantly white, middle class, able bodied, heterosexual women. And I think that maybe the shift about who gets to embody and who gets to be the quintessential Canadian teacher needs to shift and change a little bit. Okay, Allison, in your interviews, have you come across any barriers for Black men and women to enter the teaching force and to obtain employment within the school systems or school boards? This is interesting. So, yes and no. There were, of course, broader institutional challenges. One, the recognition of training, the pervasive nature of nepotism, even with school boards. So that is the hiring of the people that you like, hiring of the people that you know. And I think that there's some school boards, like the Toronto School Board, has tried to mitigate some of that by creating more anti-racist hiring practices and policies. But I don't know if that's necessarily as effective. So some other things that happen are in Ontario school systems, what we're actually noticing is the tendency to assume that persons of African descent, Black men and Black women, must be the ones who deal with the bad students, who are better able to manage racialized students. And so there is this notion that if you're a Black teacher, you have the racial currency, and then you become the manager of all things bad, right? And so you become the person who has to constantly reaffirm Black students, and of course that's part of the things that Black teachers do, but it's not exclusively that. And so the responsibility, the additional responsibility of doing inclusive work tends to fall on the shoulders of Black educators. And this tends to create barriers, right, to access to, if you're spending so much time creating, for example, policies, writing the Black history curriculum that should already be there, then it's highly likely that you might not be going for that principals training program just yet. You might want to be waiting to go do your additional qualifications because you're just overwhelmed with managing the expectations of both your institution and also your community. So these things become some of the barriers. And of course, the broader ones that continue to today are gendered expectations, the existence of sexism within schooling institutions. And even though there is the feminization of teaching, there still seems to be clear barriers and limitations to where Black women can go. Now we're seeing a rising number of Black women who are accessing the highest rungs of our educational kind of institutions. So we're seeing them as principals very rarely, yet we're not really seeing enough Black women and Black educators in general move into superintendents, right? So we're seeing them as principals, vice principals of institutions. We're not seeing enough of them as superintendents. We're not seeing enough of them getting voted as trustees within their own districts. And so these are some of the complicated mechanisms. And then, of course, we're even seeing more challenges when we think about who's in the ministry and who is holding power. So these things are still kind of difficult to gauge, but there are some systemic issues that continue to exist. What resources would I recommend to encourage educators of all races and ethnicities to adopt these liberatory pedagogies that were trailblazers by Black educators? Absolutely. So you'll notice that I've given a list of historical books that you can read on Black women's access to, liberatory access to pedagogy. So I think you can kind of get that reading list. I would also encourage folks to think through scholars who have already been doing this work, people like Annette Henry, who have written, right, about Black women and Black educators and their liberatory practices, how you can create truly inclusive spaces, and then speak to people in your community that are already doing this work, that are thinking through how to create inclusive spaces. And I would say be careful here, because it's not about leaning on those people to do the work for you. It's about learning from those models and adopting those models into teaching practice. There's tons of work on Afrocentric learning. There's tons of work on Afrocentric teaching that's out that I would encourage you to look up and think about what ways you can do that. Start reading groups in your school where you can speak to other educators who aren't Black, or who also want to think through how to create more inclusive spaces for people. So I think that it's thinking through some of these conversations in clearer ways. Thank you so much for those of you who are saying thank you. I appreciate all of your comments and your kind words. All right, so our areas where I look forward to reading more about your project. Thank you so much. Oh, someone's asking me about when the book is being released. So the book is set to be released on April 2021. So in a couple more months, but I believe it is available for pre-order. You can find that. It'll be dropped somewhere on the Amherstburg Freedom Museum's website or on the bottom of this chat. And so I'll make sure that I put that there. And okay, what suggestions do I have for Black educators who have to teach grade school students Black history, whose class demographic is mostly of color versus those in which a couple of students are Black? So I hope I'm understanding your question. I think you're asking, what advice do I have to teach Black history to a demographic that is racialized but not necessarily Black? I hope. I'm going to wait for confirmation on that. But to respond, I think you would teach Black history like you would do anything else, any other kind of history, right? It's to, one, be attuned and be sensitive to the fact that racialized communities come from, and Black communities come from, diverse places. And it's to give space and say, like, these are the ways that these histories have informed our social location, have informed how we relate to Indigenous communities, how we relate to other racialized communities. So I think that there are connecting points there. There are tons of educators who are doing this work. I mean, Kathy, you are one of those people who are doing the work of speaking to students in schools about the diverse histories of persons of African descent. So I think that people are actually out there. So lean on collaboration whenever possible to think through how education can be structured. All right, thank you so much for posting all of this stuff. You all are so wonderful. Um, and I think I got everyone. I think I got all the questions. Yes, you are right, Brenda. I think yes, going into racialized communities, incentivizing training modules, all of that, ensuring, and actually, I didn't mention also because a lot of times we don't think through the fact that ensuring that we value and that we encourage racialized students from their inception into schools to go on to do and pursue various kinds of careers, right? So if you think through some of the examples that I listed today, some of those educators were best and most encouraged by members in their community, but also members in their school who encouraged them and envisioned them as being able to be educators. And so I think we need to do that too, right? So we've got to do this work early, right? Well, when I say incentivize, I really genuinely mean like talking to students very early about like the significance of being educators and that they could be in these spots to be teachers as well, right? So it's trying to do that, but not limiting them to education. Limiting, like, education can be so expansive that it could be anything, right? So thank you all so much. I think we have reached the end. I'm going to stick around for a couple more minutes in case anyone else has any questions, but it looks like I've answered most of them. Thank you all so much for joining me on this conversation. I really appreciate the feedback and I really appreciate all of your insightful comments. And thank you for the opportunity, and thank you to the Amherstburg Freedom Museum for welcoming me and having me to have this conversation with you all.